أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أتخذ من دونه آلهة أن يردن الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين. وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين. ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون. ونفخ في السور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون. قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون. فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون. إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم. وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم أن لا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم. ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون. هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون. اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون. ولو نشاء لتمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون. ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون. ومن نعمره نكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون. وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين. ولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون. واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون. فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون. أولم ير الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم. الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم. الفاتحة.
صلوات اللهم صل على آل محمد. ہائے زہرا تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت کی گھڑی ہے. ہائے زہرا تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت کی گھڑی ہے. کیسے دروازہ ہٹاؤں کیسے محسن کو بچاؤں سانس سینے میں رکی ہے. تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت کی گھڑی ہے. ہاتھ میں جس کے میرے ہاتھ دیا تھا تم نے کہہ کے من کن تو جسے مولا کہا تھا تم نے. میں نے ہر موڑ پہ بابا ساتھ اس کا ہے نبھایا. کیا میرا جرم یہی ہے تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت کی گھڑی ہے. ہائے بابا تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت کی گھڑی ہے. تیری امت نے بنا دی ہے یہ حالت بابا. کوئی پسلی بھی نہیں میری سلامت بابا. سانس لیتی ہوں میں جس دم رکنے لگتا ہے میرا دم. صرف مرنے کی کمی ہے تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت پہ گھڑی ہے. کبھی دربار میں پیشی کو بلاتا ہے ہمیں کبھی دروازہ پہ آ کے ستاتے ہمیں. میرے یہ پھول سے بچے پوچھتے ہیں یہی مجھ سے کیا خطا ہم سے ہوئی ہے تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت پہ گھڑی ہے. ہے بھلا تم کو بتاؤں کیسے، یہ تماچوں کے نشاں تم کو دکھاؤں کیسے، تم نہ پہچان سکو گے، دیکھ کر مجھ کو کہو گے کیا میری زہرا یہی ہے، تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت کی گھڑی ہے، یہ اذیت یہ خاموشی نہیں دیکھی جاتی، مجھ سے تنہائی علی کی یہ نہیں دیکھی، تیرا پیغام سنانے حق ولایت کا بتانے، زہرا گھر گھر میں گئی ہے، تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت کے گھڑی ہے، آپ کے سوگ میں تاریخ نہ دیکھا گیا گھر، آگ دروازہ پہ امت نے لگا دی آ کر، بابا جاباد تمہارے دیکھیے گھر میں ہمارے، روشنی کیسی ہوئی ہے، تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت کی گھڑی ہے، ہائے بابا تیری زہرا پہ مصیبت کی گھڑی ہے، صلوات اللہ۔
محمد وآل محمد صلوات۔ زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، خاموش رہی رحمت کونین کی بیٹی، زہرا پہ مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، خاموش رہی رحمت کونین کی بیٹی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، کیا ہونا ہے زہرا کو ہر ایک خون کا پتہ ہے، ایک شام کا بازار ہے، ایک کرب و بلا ہے، بے غور و کفن بیٹا ہے، بے پردہ ہے بیٹی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، اسلام کے دربار میں بلوایا گیا ہے، صدیقہ ہے کونین کو جھٹلایا گیا ہے، زہرا نے اذانیں سنی دربار میں کتنی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو
سمجھتا نہیں کوئی،
رومال لیے اب بھی دعا دے ہی رہی ہے، ہر آنکھ سے اشک عزا مانگ رہی ہے، شبیر کے زخموں پہ ہے رومال یہ رکھتی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا
نہیں کوئی،
تنہا میں ہوں اور آنکھوں میں جلتا ہوا در ہے، پہلو بے شکستہ ہے اور دنیا سے سفر ہے، پائے گی سکون زہرا جب آئے گے مہدی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو
سمجھتا نہیں کوئی،
کم سن ہے حسن روتے ہیں اس صدمائے جاں کو، جی بھر کے کہے دیکھوں میں شبیر نے ماں کو، خنجر کے تلے شاہ کو یاد آئے گی ماں کی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، زہرا
کی مصیبت
کو
سمجھتا نہیں کوئی،
جلتا ہوا در آپ کے پہلو پہ گرا ہے، زہرا نہیں جی پائے یہی وجہ ہے قضا ہے، یہ کہے کہ لحد میں گئے ٹوٹی ہوئی پسلی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو
سمجھتا نہیں کوئی.
روتے ہیں تو اشکوں سے پرونے نہیں دیتے، زندہ میں سکینہ کو وہ سونے نہیں دیتے، ملنے کے لیے خلد سے خود آئے ہیں دادی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی، خاموش رہی رحمت کونین کی بیٹی، زہرا کی مصیبت کو سمجھتا نہیں کوئی. محمد وآل محمد صلوات.
سورة الفاتحة. بسم الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله، ببركة الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد، فقد قال الله في كتابه المبين: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، إنما يريد الله ليذهب عنكم الرجس أهل البيت ويطهركم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى Respected scholars, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. There's a particular concept which I have repeated a number of times, both in Jumu'ah as well as in the normal lectures that we've had. And that is in regards to gaining knowledge. And we mentioned the relationship between gaining knowledge and worship, ibadah, the salah, the fasting during the month of Ramadan, the types of taharat, for example. You know, the approach that we generally have is that I need to know what I'm doing and then I will perform the action. Whereas we mentioned last time during the Qushali of Bibi Zainab alayhi salam that within the Islamic paradigm it's not necessarily the same approach. Islam demands that you follow certain things because those things have been stipulated by revelation, and revelation operates at an end beyond the aql of the human being. So we may not necessarily understand what we're doing or why we're doing it. Revelation dictates it as such. And we mentioned that our attitude towards the Sharia should be that we follow what has been said by revelation. Slowly, gradually, because of our obedience, knowledge will then enter the heart. To summarize that discussion, we mentioned that if a person was to follow the Sharia, he's going through a process of tazkiyat an-nafs. When the heart goes through the processes of purification, then it becomes a vessel of knowledge. Then and only then will Allah give knowledge and allow knowledge to enter the heart of that particular human being. As a subset to this discussion, that knowledge is not necessarily when a person reads and memorizes and repeats and regurgitates information. Knowledge is nur min Allah. It is a light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You'll have people, for example, in our communities who've not studied the way they don't have any degrees or postgraduate under their name, but they turn out to be very intellectual individuals and they are very, very wise, especially in how they lead their lives. Why is that? Maybe it's because how they live or they lead their life. That the Sharia, but Allah has gifted them with certain knowledge. When we come to this particular verse of the Holy Quran, when Allah speaks about the Ahlul Bayt, Allah makes it a very strong concept, an idea. He presents an idea that these individuals, we have purified them with a thorough purification. So you can imagine now, when we speak about the Ahlul Bayt, universities or people who used to study under the of individuals, Allah mentions a particular purification. No form of rijs or najasa or impurity or filth or dirtiness has ever entered in their lives. They are pure. Once a human being is pure, what comes after it? Knowledge. When the heart is absolutely pure, it becomes a message. And therefore, when you look at the Ahlul Bayt, you find that they were the peak of the knowledgeable individuals that existed in their time. Fatima al-Zahra alayha salam, salawatullah wa salam alayha. Being a part of Ahl al-Kisa, she is also part of those who are mentioned within the verse. That Allah has purified her with a thorough purification, meaning that she was the embodiment of knowledge, just like her father, just like her husband, just like her sons. She was the embodiment of knowledge, the representation of pure knowledge. Now see, there's a subset to this discussion. Many a times what happens is that when we live our lives, we develop a particular interest. Happens to all of us. We develop a particular interest. So what do? We go and study. We research. We do a lot of research, especially when it comes to Islamic sciences. And Islam, you have many different sciences. You have Rijal, you have Tafsir, you have Hadith, you have this, you have that. And some of us, somewhere along, in our communities, will develop an interest to go and look into, for example, Rijal, or Hadith, or Usul, or whatever it is. And for the next 5 to 10 years, all he will be doing is just reading and extrapolating different types of knowledge. He will then write academic papers, which are read by 10 or 15 different people, have them published in different journals, only to find that in the end, when he reflects back at his journey of learning about Islam, it has not added any benefit to him. And this happens quite a lot to many, many people in the different demographics of communities. You develop an interest, you study so much, but then 10 or 15 years later you realize, well, what was the point of all that? I could have spent my time, prioritized my time somewhere else. And this brings about a very interesting discussion about what is known as ilm al-nafi'. Ilm which is beneficial for us. In the ta'aqibat of Salat al-Asr, we actually engage in a dua. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ilmi la yanfa'. Protect me from that knowledge that does not benefit me. Knowledge which is beneficial is knowledge which is your intellectual capacity, and that's it. Something that is now culminated practically within your life. Imam al-Ghazali, famous Sunni scholar, famously he came forward and he said, and he went through a spiritual crisis. If you read his biography, it's very interesting. He goes through a spiritual crisis towards when he's quite old. And he goes into a spiritual crisis and he leaves his job, and he was one of the leading professors in Baghdad. So he leaves his job, he goes and he wanders in the lands, and he joins a Sufi cult, and he learns a lot from the Sufis. So a lot of people think that Imam Ghazali became a Sufi, but he didn't. He learned from them, but he didn't become a Sufi. He came back and he wrote a book, and he said, the book is called "Oh My Son, Ya Bunayya." That's the name of the book. Someone sent him a letter. He said, look, my son is really interested in learning about Hausa and, you know, these different Islamic sciences. What advice do you have for him? And he writes a book. It's a short pamphlet. It's like a small book. And within that book, he says, don't worry about what this scholar says, what that scholar says, what this scholar says about kalam, what that scholar says about kalam, what this scholar says about fiqh, what that scholar says about fiqh. It says, when you learn this, in the end you realize that it adds no benefit to you whatsoever. Because that's what Islamic sciences is. You go into history, you look at the different opinions of different scholars on a particular issue. When you learn all of that, what benefit does it add in your life? And he says, I actually understood this later on in my life. It says, if I were you in my position, if I was you in your position, learn the basics of religion, learn the fiqh that you need to learn, and become a master in something that you have an interest in. To go into Islamic sciences and the depths of Islamic sciences, in the end, will not bring you any benefit. You're a pharmacist, you're a lawyer, you're a solicitor. Learning about the different opinions of, for example, the scholars when it comes to al-bada', how is that going to add value to your life? So something very interesting that he says. So anyways, he then recommends this young son, this young boy, learn the fundamentals of religion, then work. Add value by giving back to the community. Whatever your interest is, become a master in it, and then slowly give back to the community. In the end, he makes another point. He says that whatever you study, make sure that ibadah is alongside it. Whenever you read a book, make sure that there is dua alongside it. Make sure that there is Quran alongside it. Make sure that there is salah alongside it. Ibn Sina had the same opinion. They say Ibn Sina was going through one of the philosophical books and he had studied it in such depth. He had memorized the text, but he just couldn't understand it. That's a different level altogether. He was reading a book, philosophical book. It was so beyond his intellectual capacity. He memorized the words of that book, but he just couldn't understand what was being said. And then he says, one day I went to the Masjid, I recited Turaq as-Salah, and slowly information started to make sense. Ilm should always go alongside ibadah. And slowly Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open up your heart and allow you to understand the information that is there. When you look at knowledge, knowledge is like an ocean. Remember this. This is one of the hadiths of the Imam alayhi salam when he says that knowledge is like an ocean, and it's very easy for a person to get lost in the ocean. In such a circumstance, we need scholars. Never attempt to do something without a scholar, because a scholar will be able to guide you to what you actually need. There's a difference between wanting something and needing something. When you enter the ocean without the compass, without, for example, any aid, you will be lost. But if there is someone to direct you and guide you, you will find it easier than you think. Now when we speak about Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The verse mentions that she went through a process of thorough purification. She was born pure, she passed away and she left this world in a very pure state, meaning that her heart was a vessel of knowledge. And when we look at her history, we find that she was a source of knowledge, not just for the people around her, but even for the A'immat al-Athhar, even for the coming generations. They say specifically, and it's a very beautiful concept that the scholars have gone into, when Rasulullah left this world, she entered a state of grief. She entered a state of sorrow. And the only thing that was able to console her grief was an angel. And the angel used to descend very occasionally, very frequently. The angel used to descend and he used to sit alongside al-Zahra al-Batul alayhi salam. Now some say that this angel was Jibreel himself. Some say it was other angels. Anyhow, this angel would come, he would sit alongside the holy lady, and he would then begin to give her information. She was a source of knowledge. He then began to give her information of what would happen in this world. He would then sit alongside, she would then sit alongside Amir al-Mu'mineen, and she would dictate what the information was, and the Imam would then write down that information. Eventually this was known as the Mus'haf of Fatima. The Mus'haf of Fatima, or the book of Fatima. You know, some people, they say, where can we buy this book? This book is not something that's there available in our hands. Some people think that this is the Quran of Fatima. No, it's not the Quran of Fatima. Al-Mus'haf al-Fatima is the revelation that was given to Fatima through an angel. And of course, there are some narrations that explain what exactly Mus'haf of Fatima is. So for example, Imam Bakr, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, as well as his son Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam, he says, وَأَمَّا إِنَّهُ لَيْسَ فِيهِ شَيْءٌ مِّنَ الْحَلَالِ وَالْحَرَامِ. It's not a book of fiqh where she outlines what is halal and haram. This is not what Mus'haf of Fatima is. He says, وَلَكِنْ فِيهِ عِلْمٌ مَا يَكُونُ. In fact, she was given knowledge of what will happen in the future. Whatever major events that take place in this world, that knowledge was given to Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. Imam Sadiq, in a different narration, he says, فِيهِ جَمِيعُ مَا يَحْتَاجُ النَّاسِ إِلَى يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ. It has everything that mankind needs until the day of judgment. You know, and when we have certain reports that say that whenever the Imam needed answers, they would refer to the Jami' of Fatima, the Mus'haf of Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. And they would derive answers from that book. She became a source of knowledge, not just for the people around her, but for the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim as-salam. That shows us what a level this holy personality had. Imam Hassan al-Askari as well as Imam Bakr alayhi salatu was-salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. He says, Nahnu hujjatullah. We are the proof of Allah upon you. On the day of judgment, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks each and every single one of us, did you not recognize your proof? The proof is the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. He says that we are a proof over you. On the day of judgment, we are an argument over the people. Wa ummuna Fatima hujjatullah alayna. But our mother Fatima is a proof over us. So automatically, when we put and collate all of these narrations together, we realize that the position of Fatima is greater than what we can ever imagine. Greater than all of the A'immat al-Athar. Except for perhaps Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salatu wassalam, and the Holy Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we look at her knowledge, coming from a second perspective, when we look at her knowledge, and this is something quite remarkable, something that you should think about. We find that her knowledge, her sermons, her sayings, it was infused with the knowledge of the Quran. You see, at the time of the Muslim community, in the formative years, in the beginning years, when the Prophet introduced Islam, the people, the companions that were there around him, they didn't have such an in-depth understanding of Islam. Let's be honest. They were new Muslims. You know, when someone converts to the religion of Islam, his understanding of Islam is not as strong as a person who has been a Muslim for many, many years. It's a natural fact. Rasulullah presented the religion of Islam. Many people came towards the religion of Islam. Many people converted even after, towards the final years of the Holy Prophet's life. So people didn't have that strong level of understanding as the Prophet did, for example. So whenever the Prophet used to deliver a sermon, and when you read the sermon of Ghadir, for example, the sermon of Ramadan, and so on and so forth, you'll find that he makes sentences that is infused with the message of the Holy Quran. So he takes a verse from the Holy Quran, paraphrases it in a very eloquent way, and he creates a sermon around it. Likewise, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. When you look at Dua Kumail, for example, Allama Majlisi, he says that Dua Kumail is the greatest dua of Amir al-Mu'mineen. In fact, all of the du'as that we have, the greatest dua is Dua al-Kumail. When you look at the sentences of Dua Kumail, you can trace back where exactly he has taken this information from the Quran. Now remember, during that time, people were new Muslims. Their understanding of the Holy Quran was not as strong, let alone being able to take and extract information from here and there, from the middle of the Quran, the beginning, the end, and then to make an entire sermon based on it. And basically, these sermons were introduced to the people spontaneously. It's not like they used to go home, write sermons, review them, and then of course deliver it to the people. No, someone came and asked the question, and the Imam or the Prophet would then deliver the sermon straight away. Likewise, Fatima al-Zahra, when you read her sermon of Fadak, you realize that every knowledge or every word is infused with the message of the Holy Quran. Especially when she was attacked by bringing forth witnesses with regards to Fadak and so on and so forth, her responses came directly from the Quran, which meant that the opposition did not have that level of understanding of the Quran the way she did. And that what makes the sermon of Fadak remarkable in itself. Just a few words about the sermon of Fadak, and then inshallah we'll end. When you look at the sermon of Fadak, actually before that there's an important point that needs to be made. You see, this evidences that we have show that Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam was the embodiment of knowledge at her time. She was the pure manifestation of ilm. But then do you find her, for example, going into public and giving that ilm to the people? Was that her responsibility? Remember, she was a scholar, greater than all the other A'immat al-Athar, greater than her sons and her lineage. But then with that knowledge that was there with her, would she go into the public and give knowledge to the people, for example? Did she used to sit on the member of Rasulullah and deliver lectures? Did she used to have open Q&A sessions with, for example, the open public? With the women, yes. Even we mentioned about Bibi Zainab alayhi salam, yes, she used to have tafsir sessions with the women of Kufa and so on and so forth. With the women, yes, they used to give services to the women of Medina and Kufa. But what about the men? Did they openly go and give majalis, for example, openly in a public forum? These are very key questions that we need to ask. As a subset to this discussion, there's a very interesting question that arises, especially when we speak about marja'iyya, isn't it? Can a woman be a marja? It's a very interesting question. Can a woman be a marja? But unfortunately, I find it quite annoying, to say the least, that people approach this discussion from a theoretical perspective. They say that, well, when we look at the riwayat, there's no riwayat that talks about a woman can't be a marja, this, that. You know, we talk about ilm when we speak about marja'iyya, isn't it? That the marja is the person who has the greatest level of proficiency when extracting laws from the sources of ahadith and Quran. The maraja that we have, they are the elite when it comes to knowledge. That's fine. We agree. You know, science, for example, there's many research journals out there explaining that today, for example, in 2022, the greatest achievers in schools and universities are women. So yes, a woman does have the academic capacity to be greater than a man. She is more intellectually clever than a man. But is that the role of the marja? Is a marja chosen just because of his ilm? Ilm is just one facet of his responsibilities. What about, for example, the political and the social perspectives or aspects of marja'iyya? Why do we not talk about that? Why do we ask the question, can a woman be a marja? Why don't we ask a different question in fact? Should a woman become a marja? And that's even a more interesting question because it makes us think, it makes us ask questions that are very, very uncomfortable to ask. And we of course go back to the life of Fatima al-Zahra as well as Bibi Zainab alayhim as-salam. Allahumma salli ala. In Qom today, for example, we have hawzat for the women. Yes, if there are, for example, daughters in this community who want to go to Qom to study, there are facilities for them to go and study. Even in Najaf, there are facilities for women to go and study. And what's interesting is that within these hawzat for the women, you'll find mujtahidas. Women who are mujtahids. Why don't we hear about them? Why is it that the world has not heard about these mujtahidas? Maybe perhaps they don't want to be known. Has anyone thought of that? Maybe they don't want their name to go out there. Because they realize that yes, although they have knowledge, they have certain other priorities and responsibilities which are more important. And maybe one of those priorities and responsibilities is that they should not have a public platform. That's a theory that should be looked into. When we look at the life of Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam, she was the embodiment of knowledge. But do you see her, for example, teaching Abu Dhar al-Ghaffari, Salman al-Farisi, Ammar ibn Yasir? Does she give public sermons? Which then brings us to Fadak. The reason why Fadak takes place, the sermon of Fadak, is because she went through a process of oppression. In the state of oppression, this is an exception where she came out and she spoke in public. When she delivered the sermon in the courtyard or in the courthouse, it was a public announcement to the people of Medina of her ilm and her position. It was the first time that the people were exposed to such levels of knowledge, that even today scholars are still unraveling the secrets of what was mentioned 1400 years ago. When she delivers the sermon, people then realize her knowledge. Likewise, Zainab al-Kubra, when she spoke out in the courthouse of Ibn Ziyad as well as Yazid ibn Muawiyah, it was the first time that the people understood the knowledge of Zainab. Why didn't she do it beforehand? In the state of peace, for example. When they were driven into oppression, when they were oppressed and their rights were taken away from them, they used the public platform to actually express their knowledge to the people. Now when you come to the sermon of Fadak, it's a very interesting sermon. And in that sermon, she summarizes the whole of the religion of Islam. Everything that you and I know about our aqidah, our fiqh, and our akhlaq, and how we should live our lives, is summarized by the Holy Lady Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. And she does it eloquently and she does it beautifully. Now in the process of doing so, it's very interesting, in the process of doing so, she begins the sermon with this particular statement. The first opening words of her statement, Alhamdulillah ala ma an'am, walahu shukr ala ma alham. She says, glory to be Allah, glory be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his great blessings. Let that sink in. Why was Fadak mentioned in the first place? Why was the sermon of Fadak given? Her house was attacked. Her ribs were broken. Her son was taken away from her, Muhsin rahmatullah alayhi salam. She was abused and she went through many different levels of abuse. Fadak was taken away from her. The wilayah of Imam alayhi salam was taken away from him. And she would go door to door, knocking on the doors of Medina, and she would say to them, you were there in Ghadir, and you heard exactly what the Prophet of Islam said. Why do you stand silently? She goes through all these different levels of oppression and abuse. Yet she delivers the sermon, and the opening statement of the sermon is, glory be to Allah for all of the blessings that He has given. Today, if some of us go through, for example, a problem in our lives, we are the first ones to move away from Allah. Yet she turns to Allah and she thanks Him for everything that she has been given. What is that approach that she has in her life? That she's adopted in her life? And what a magnificent way to live. You see, the human being has been developed with a brain. It is very difficult for a human being to think about a good thing than it is to think about a bad thing. And we, for example, it's not even an example, we naturally go and think about bad things before thinking about good things. And they say that when a person forces himself to think about good things, you're going through the process where you're rewiring your mind. And it's very hard. If I ask you a question, for example, what are 3 good things that happened to you today? You'll be sitting there thinking, what are the 3 good things that happened to me today? It's very difficult. But if a person does so on a daily basis, automatically you're rewiring your mind. And that makes you a happier person, because now you're thinking about positive things. And that makes you approach life from a positive perspective. And the first thing she says is, shukr be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all the good that He has given me, despite all of the abuse and the torment that she's gone through. Then when it comes to the musibah of her father, she mourns and she goes through a process of grief, until the people of Medina came towards her and said, Ya Ali, tell your wife to either cry during the night or the day. Don't allow her to continuously mourn. In Karbala, when Zainab cried out, her enemies and her foes, they were even on their knees crying because of the cries of Zainab. Imagine the cries of Fatima, huh? And how that affected the people around her. So they came and they complained to Imam alayhi salam. The Imam goes into the outskirts of Medina and he builds a small room, Bayt al-Ahzan, the house of sorrows. They say Fatima would come in and she would cry and cry and cry until she would lose consciousness. Then at the end of the day, the Imam alayhi salam with his sons, they would go and they would bring the mother back to the house. She would go and sit alongside the grave of Rasulullah. And when she would sit alongside the grave of Rasulullah, she would mention these words. She would say, ماذا على من شم تربة أحمد لا يشم مدى الزمان غواليا صبت علي مصائب لو عنها صبت على العيام سرنا الليالي. She says, what happens to the one who smells the grave of Rasulullah? He would never be able to smell such fragrance anywhere else in this world. Wallah, by God, if the sorrows that I went through fell upon the day, the days would become night. This is the extensivity of the sorrows of Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. And in her final moments we find that she is surrounded by her children. Imam al-Hasan, Imam al-Husayn, Zainab and Kulthum. It's interesting how history repeats itself. Young children witness the martyrdom of their mother. But then 60 years later, again you had children who witnessed the martyrdom of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. We have the likes of Sukaina. They say on the 11th of Muharram, Zainab mounted the women on the horses. She mounted the children on the horses. Then she turned around, she said, where is Sukaina? She looked this way and that way, she could not find Sukaina. Eventually they found Sukaina alongside the body of her father, Abi Abdullah. And she latched onto his body. The narrations say that the guards, the soldiers, they came and they had to drag Sukaina off the body of her father. When she came back to Zainab, she said, yeah, oh my aunt Zainab, I heard my father say to me, oh my daughter, give this wasiyah to my followers. يا شيعتي مهما شربتم ما عذب فاذكروني أو سمعتم بغريب أو شهيد فاندبوني. He says, oh my Shia, whenever you drink water, then remember me. Never forget me when you drink water. And when you hear of a shaheed or a stranger, then stand and engage in my mourning. إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. If we can recite, there are certain mu'mineen who are under intensive care. For example, the likes of Mohsin Badami. If we can recite Dua Shafa for the mu'min and of course all of the mu'mineen who are under such situations, inshallah, all together. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. 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 أَمَّن يُجِيبُ الْمُضْطَرَّ إِذَا دَعَاهُ وَيَكْشِفُ السُّوءَ وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على
سینے میں لیے رنج و الم کرب و بلا کا بابا سے ہے ملنے کو چلی ام ابیہا آنکھوں سے لہو بہتا ہے پہلو ہے شکستہ یا فاطمہ زہرا 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 یا ام ابیہا یا فاطمہ زہرا یا فاطمہ زہرا یا فاطمہ زہرا امت نے بہت آپ کو تر پایا ہے بی بی ہر حق کے لیے آپ کو ترسایا ہے بی بی غاصب نے جو دربار میں بلوایا ہے بی بی اس دکھ سے لرزنے لگا خود عرش خدا کا یا فاطمہ زہرا یا فاطمہ زہرا شبیر کی دنیا میں ولادت سے بھی پہلے کہتی تھی یہ زہرا کہ بہت سہتی ہوں صدمے بچہ یہ میرا کوکھ میں بے چین بہت ہے بچہ میرا کہتا ہے کہ اماں میں ہوں پیاسا یا فاطمہ زہرا یا فاطمہ زہرا یا فاطمہ زہرا سینے میں ازل سے ہی میرے کرب و بلا ہے جاتے ہوئے زہرا نے یہ دنیا سے کہا ہے کیا شام میں ہونا ہے یہ سب مجھ کو پتا ہے تپتے ہوئے صحرا میں ہے شبیر کا لاشا یا فاطمہ زہرا یا فاطمہ زہرا یا فاطمہ زہرا دنیا سے چلی کہتی ہوئی بنت پیمبر، غم کرب و بلا کا ہے لیے یہ دل مضطر، آتا ہے تصور میں میرے شام کا منظر، اللہ رکھے زینب و کلثوم کا پردہ، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یہ کام رہا صدیوں سے بس اہل عزا کا، پیاسوں کے لیے بہتا رہا اشکوں کا دریا، شبیر کا پرسا دیا زہرا کو ہمیشہ، شبیر کا دو مادریں شبیر کا پرسا، یا فاطمہ یا فاطمہ زہرا، ماؤں سے عزاداروں کی زہرا نے کہا ہے، عاشور کے مقصد کا بھرم تم نے رکھا ہے، بچوں کو عزاداری پر قربان کیا ہے، محشر میں چکاؤں گی میں قرضہ یہ تمہارا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا ام ابیہا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، ہائے زینب ہائے شام، ہائے زینب ہائے شام، ہائے زینب ہائے شام، ہائے زینب ہائے شام، یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین، محمد و آل محمد صلوات۔ بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم، السلام علیک یا رسول اللہ، السلام علیک یا حبیب اللہ، السلام علیک یا امیر المؤمنین وابن سید الوسیین، السلام علیک یا فاطمة الزہراء سیدۃ نساء العالمین، السلام علیک یا حسن المجتبى، السلام علیک یا ابا عبد اللہ الحسین، وعلى علي بن الحسين، وعلى أولاد الحسين، وعلى أصحاب الحسين، السلام عليكم يا شهداء كربلاء جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته، السلام عليك يا مولى وابن مولى، السلام عليك يا غريب الغرباء، السلام عليك يا سلطان أبا الحسن علي بن موسى الرضا ورحمة الله وبركاته، السلام عليك يا صاحب الزمان، الأمان 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 من فتنة الزمان، السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن، السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن، السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته، اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، اللهم كل وليك الحجة بن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها